My name is Beatriz Mans. I'm a professor of geography and a professor and chair in the Department of Ethnic Studies. The event tonight is being webcast. Today, September 18th, is National Independence Day in Chile. Viva Chile without the last name. So to everyone in Chile, un muy feliz 18. Les deseamos todos los chilenos de Berkeley, del área de la Bahía, de Davis y los otros chilenos que nos acompañan aquí. Feliz 18. The idea of bringing President Lagos to Berkeley began about a year ago in conversations with Agustin and Valeria Huneos. And Berkeley thanks you very much for your continued support during this whole year-long process. I must say that it was not until I actually saw President Lagos and Mrs. Luisa Duran come out of the plane that I really believed this was happening. You cannot imagine what that felt like when I actually finally saw them here in Berkeley. Ricardo Lagos presided over extraordinary changes in Chile. As a Chilean and Berkeley faculty, I want to thank you, President Lagos, above all for your democratic commitment and personal courage in bringing down the Pinochet dictatorship. ¡Viva Chile! I would like to thank the Center for Latin American Studies, all the students who got involved so enthusiastically in this process, and the faculty for the support in making this visiting professorship of Professor Lagos possible here at Berkeley. The moderator this evening is Professor Harley Shaken, Chair of Berkeley's Center for Latin American Studies. Professor Shaken.
On behalf of the Center for Latin American Studies and the University of California at Berkeley, I'm very pleased to welcome all of you here today. I have a brief comment about the format for the evening. I will be introducing our Chancellor, Robert J. Birgeneau, who will speak briefly, and then we will have President Lagos give his address. We will be taking questions. We've distributed cards. Please pass the card and your question to one of the aisles. We will be collecting them and taking as many questions as possible after the event. It is truly an honor to have President Lagos with us here today. He has brought unusual insight, integrity, moral courage, and a commitment to democracy to Chile, to Latin America, and to the world. It is an honor for us to have him here tonight and to have him here teaching a special seminar on democracy and development in Latin America. We have quite a number of dignitaries from throughout the world here tonight, too many to recognize, but there is one person I very much want to recognize, Luisa Duran, widely acknowledged as the best First Lady of Chile. And finally, it's my honor to introduce our Chancellor, Robert J. Birgeneau, who told me to keep it brief, but I can't resist saying he is a person who has brought real vision and commitment to our campus. Chancellor Birgeneau.
Thank you so much, Harley. It's my very great pleasure to welcome everyone to this evening's lecture organized by the Center for Latin American Studies at Berkeley. As you've heard, we're especially honored to have former President of Chile, Ricardo Lagos, joining us as a visiting professor at the center this fall. The career of Ricardo Lagos, who served as President of Chile from the year 2000 until March of this year, embodies integrity, moral courage, and democratic values, all of which reflect the ideals of the University of California at Berkeley. Ricardo Lagos is among the most highly regarded political leaders in Latin America. He is widely credited with being an architect of Chile's economic success and deepening the country's democratic transition. Ricardo Lagos has had a long and distinguished career. He studied law at the University of Chile, in Santiago, receiving his degree in 1960. He came to the United States for graduate studies at Duke, the only defect in his otherwise illustrious background, receiving his PhD in economics in 1966. And think what you missed in the free speech movement here at Berkeley. In 1969, he was named Secretary General of the University of Chile, the largest and most prestigious public university in his country. After the overthrow of the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende on September 11th, 1973, Ricardo Lagos and his family went into exile in Argentina, where he took the position of Secretary General of the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. During the 1980s, Lagos assumed a fundamental role in the fight for democracy. For his efforts, he was arrested and imprisoned for nearly 3 weeks in 1986. The next year, as the president of the Committee of the Left for Free Elections, he called on all citizens and parties to enroll en masse in the electoral registries and vote no in the national plebiscite of October 1988. Lagos became the undisputed leader opposing the Pinochet regime after appearing on a political television show. In one memorable moment, he looked directly into the camera and accusingly raised his index finger to say directly to all viewers, "General Pinochet has not been honest with the country. I will remind you, General Pinochet, that on the day of the 1980 plebiscite, you said that President Pinochet would not be a candidate in 1989. And now you promise the country another 8 years of tortures, murders, and human rights violations." Lagos's brave act stunned the nation, and voters turned out in droves to reject another 8-year term for Pinochet in the plebiscite. Free elections were held the following year in December of 1989. That index finger became a symbol of courage, defiance, human rights, and democracy. It was a daring moment in Chilean politics and a turning point in the transition to democracy. In 1990, with the election of Patricio Aylwin as president, Lagos was named Minister of Education, and in 1994, he became Minister of Public Works. Ricardo Lagos was elected President of Chile in the year 2000, the first socialist since the election of Salvador Allende in 1970. As president, Lagos stressed the need to resolve Chile's abysmal human rights record of the recent past and established a commission that began investigating the tragic post-coup years. Lagos's other achievements in office are similarly historic and have moved the country in a more democratic direction. He is credited with using his own personal stature to further restrict the power of the military and to reform some of the military statutes. He named Michelle Bachelet the first woman head of the Defense Department. Michelle Bachelet succeeded him as the first woman president of Chile. On a lighter note, he's also a weekend gardener, an occasional rock climber, and reads histories and listens to Mozart in his spare hours as well. And in a side conversation, since my wife cannot be here because she's in Toronto with her 97-year-old mother, I learned that his mother lived to 104 and got to be alive during this incredible life he led, including, however, seeing his great service as president of Chile. They're both very fortunate. President Lagos left office on March 11, 2006, having made historic achievements. Chile is considered an economic model that has also achieved strong political and social stability. He is widely respected across the political spectrum within Chile, and his accomplishments have been widely praised worldwide. Summarizing his administration in December 2005, President Lagos said, "In these years, we sought the frontier of the possible." If you could now come up, please. It is now my very great pleasure to bestow the Berkeley Medal, the university's highest honor, on Ricardo Lagos in recognition of his outstanding achievements in the public interest. His search for the frontier of the possible and contributions to society illustrate the public service ideals to which Berkeley aspires. Let's now invite Ricardo Lagos, Berkeley Medalist, and I just can't control myself. I have to say, you know, if we manage to change the law so Arnold Schwarzenegger can become president, I have a different idea. So, I didn't say that because I'm required as a state employee to be politically neutral. So let's now invite President Lagos to speak to us about challenges for Latin America.
Well, Mr. Chancellor, members of the faculty, compatriotas, I would like, first of all, thank for this invitation and the distinction that I have been awarded. Thanking for this invitation to a university that has gained a place as an outstanding academic institution in the US and abroad. But probably more important, in addition to being an outstanding academic institution, an institution that is known for the way to embrace diversity, creativity, different ways of thinking. A university that made history in 1964 through the student movement with regard to the free speech movement. It's a distinction that I understand I received as a former president of Chile for what the Chilean people has been able to do. I understand that Chile has been able to perform quite a number of events in the last 16 years. And I think that is a good way to say Viva Chile in this Día de la Independencia de Chile. I have been invited to talk about the challenges in Latin America development. And I think that it's rather difficult to talk in general about Latin America, the dangers of generalization, to think that those 20-something countries are very much alike. Reality is quite different. And therefore, when you're going to make some generalization at the same time, probably you're going to do the right thing. The second point that I would like to point out is that the personal influence, the way that is our own personal experience, till what extent is going to be presented in what I would like to talk with you this evening. I understand that it's difficult to make general comments, and I also understand that those general comments that I can make are to some extent influenced from my personal experiences. And I would like then to start with two statements and one fact. First statement, the institutional building in Latin America has been improving, at least with regard to the electoral process, in a sense that all the presidents today in Latin America has been democratically elected, and it's true. During the last 8 years, in 15 cases, the president has been unable to finish their term. Nevertheless, in the difference with the past, in those 15 cases, the rule of law has been accepted, and those that came after the president decided to resign were those that, according to the Constitution, were supposed to take power. What I'm trying to say is that today we have more democracy in our countries than what we used to have in the past. It means a more democratic country to elect a former trade union leader in a country like in Brazil. It's a more democratic country to elect a former leader of the indigenous movement like the one Evo Morales that we have in Bolivia. It is a more democratic country to challenge the idea of gender and to have a woman be an elected president in Chile. It's a tremendous cultural change. It's a more democratic country that after 70 years, you elect somebody from the opposition in Mexico. Or after almost more than a century, you elect a left-wing coalition that for the first time in Uruguay represents something different from Colorados and Blanco the usual traditional parties in Uruguay. What I'm trying to say as a first statement is that normally we don't realize that there has been some advances in the region. Second point, I think that in the last 15, 20 years, 25 years, there has been a growing influence of professional people that knows how to run the economy. And to have a fiscal responsibility doesn't mean that you belong to a right-wing party or to a left-wing party. That simply means that you know how to run the economy. And therefore, it seems that now in the region, different political parties has professional people, well-trained, and of course, the economic policies are going to be different if you have a right-wing politician or a left-wing politician or something like that. But everybody knows what are the rules of the game. And it doesn't mean that you are neoliberal or you are left-wing oriented, because that now everybody knows what is going to be bad in the near future. In other words, populist measures in most Latin American countries are not part of the rules of the game. And the fact that I want to mention after these two statements is that during the last years, all Latin American countries have a reasonable growth rate if we take the average. At least Latin American countries have been able to have a similar growth to developed countries. Now, this means that in Latin America today, with the exception of 2 or 3 countries, no Latin American country qualifies to foreign aid. In other words, now what we have in the region is middle-income countries, quite different from what we have in the past. And therefore, the kind of problem that we are facing are quite different to the kind of problem that we used to face in the past. I remember that when the trade talks in Seattle failed in 1998, what Latin American countries were talking about, we want trade, not aid. We want to be able to have trade with some other countries in a fair way. It's not aid what is really to take out to have a more rapid development. And sometimes, you know, Latin American countries then realize that now the big issue is how they are going to be involved in a world that is more global, in a world that is more globalized, but at the same time, who are going to put the rules of the game in this process of globalization. And this is what really makes the difference from what are the challenges today and what are the challenges that we used to have 20 or 30 years ago. Then, what are, according to my view, the major challenges? I would like to classify them in 3 different challenges. The first one is how you build societies that are able to give equal opportunities to all those people. Second, how are we going to build societies that are able to face the past and the transitional period that goes from dictatorship to democracy with regard to the issue of violations of human rights? And third, how Latin American countries are going to be able to incorporate to a global process that is here to stay, and in what form. Those, I think, are the major challenges. And when I see what do we try to do in my 6 years as president in these different 3 major areas of concern, I would say that we made an attempt to face the challenges in the best way that we could do. And when I was talking about moving the frontier of what was possible in Chile, what I was trying to say was that it's in these three areas we were able to face challenges, because at the end, we have the backing of the majority of the Chilean people. And in some cases, because we don't have majority in parliament, given our peculiar electoral system, I have to go straight to talk to the people in order to be able to approve some laws in parliament. Let me tell you that to be in public office means at the end to believe in what you mention to the people that you are going to say. Sometimes I went hungry. I have to put the rules on the table in order to get some legislation passed. Here in the audience is a very distinguished member in parliament that was extremely helpful in my administration. But let me tell you, not all of them were in that way. And the question is that it is essential in some particular moment to act in that way. Let me talk about the first challenge. It's true that it's essential to have economic growth. It is essential to have investment. One of the things of which I'm more proud is that late in my administration, we were able to reach the target of 30% of investment vis-a-vis our gross domestic product. And if you're going to keep an economy growing, you need to have to keep investment. Nevertheless, the traditional thinking that it was enough to have economic growth, period, we know that is not true anymore. Or, if you allow me to say, it will take a long, long time to transform that growth in some kind of distribution of income so that everybody will have equal opportunities. In other words, growth is essential, but growth alone are not going to perform what every society is supposed to perform, which is give equal opportunities to everybody. And therefore, if you want to have equal opportunities, then what you will need to do is to have public policies in order to be able to transform that growth in very concrete measures in different areas, in different policies. The trickle down, the idea that growth alone is going to perform the miracle, is not true anymore. And therefore, I think that unless you have very clear public policies, and I would say that probably the major reason why there has been some unrest in the region is because in many countries, society has perceived that there has been economic growth, but that economic growth has not been transformed in policies that reach everybody. You cannot be talking that we have a growth rate of 4%, 5%, 6%, 7%, if at the same time the school system remains the same, the healthcare system remains the same, the infrastructure remains the same. I mean, if there is no concrete step. And let me tell you that it's my impression that the worst deficit in Latin America is not to discover the right public policies, right, quote unquote, but rather the ability to implement those policies. So the issue is not what to do, but how to do it. And the more I travel on Latin America, the more I discover that what to do has many answers. How to do it, very few answers. And it's this difference. Everybody knows what to do. Very few knows how to do it, how to deliver. And this, I think, is essential. And the difference with regard left and right has to do more in this specific answer. Just one example from my government. The example is very simple. We were able to take down the poverty, people living under the poverty line for more than 50%. 41, 42% of the people were poor in 1990, and now it's 18%. Indigenous people is 6%. Those indigenous people represent 225,000 families. And there was a very interesting discussion. If you know who they are, where they live, what is the identity card, why don't you just send them a check every month and you solve the problem? They are not indigenous anymore. But then the question is, what about dignity? Is that what you want to do? For some people, it was just to send them a voucher, and they can buy the essential things, and they are not poor anymore. But we did something quite different. Knock the door on the house of those people and explain them that because they were indigent, they were entitled to a lot of rights to demand from the state, from society. In other words, there are different ways to implement things, and we did it in that way. In short, I think that the reform of the state, the management of the public sector activities, is becoming an essential part of what we would like to do in Latin America. The public sector has to be able to deliver public goods. What are public goods? Public goods are those goods that the particular society defines that are so important that has to be available for everybody. Let me give an explanation. When you are talking about a market economy, today nobody will discuss a market economy. A market economy is essential in order to allocate resources. The question is that if the market economy is the only way to define what goods and services are going to be available for the citizens, then you will have a market economy and a market society at the same time, with all the inequities that exist in a market will be transferred to a market society. What democracy is at the end? Democracy at the end is a way to define what goods and services should be available for everybody, no matter what the market should say. When you say, look, I want compulsory education for everybody during 4 years, that's a decision taken by the citizens, not by the consumers. All of us are citizens. And as citizens, all of us weigh the same, It's true, all of us also are consumers, but as consumers, all of us weigh in a different way. Therefore, when you are talking about to define equal opportunities for everybody, the major question is what kind of public goods are going to be available for everybody to have equal opportunities. Now, in the past, public goods were supposed to be the responsibility of the government. Not today anymore. It could be also the responsibility of the private sector if you have the right way to do it. But the big issue is, and the big difference with neoliberals, is that this second part about public goods, they don't agree with that. And when you ask me what are the big differences, I would say this is one of the major differences that we have. To think that it's not possible to have the market mechanism being used to build a market society. A society is going to be defined at the end by the citizens, and governments are to listen to citizens. Now, I would say that probably this is the core of the problem that Latin America has to face. And the major challenge, how are you going to be able to build in Latin America in such a way in order that there is opportunities for everybody? And that means then that in many cases you have to discriminate. And to discriminate means that you have to give more, in many cases, to those that have less. If you have a voucher and you go to buy education, you are going to buy different qualities of education because in addition to the voucher, you will have your own money or you will not have money at all. And that's going to be the difference. Therefore, equal opportunities in basic education, in high school education, in the university system, is going to make this difference. Let me tell you just one figure that as president I'm extremely proud. In today's Chile, out of 10 university students, 7 are first generation in their families that reached the university. How many countries can say that? Now, after this applause that I thank, still there is a long way to go, because in today's Chile, of those students that belong to the highest 20% in income of their parents, 60% are in the university. And those that belong to the lowest 20%, only 12% are at the university. 60 versus 12. Now, it's true, 16 years ago, the ratio was 40 and 4. You see? In other words, in order to be able to provide them equal opportunities, you need to have the courage to implement strong reforms. We implement strong reforms in our health system. Everybody told me, don't do that. Look, President Clinton, not even Hillary was able to do that, the health reform in the US. You are going to have some problem, they say. But nevertheless, we decided to do that, and it was possible to do it. And now we have a different system. In other words, I would say that how Latin Americans are going to be able to solve, that's the first challenge. Second challenge, Latin American countries, at some time or another, unfortunately in many countries, will have to face what happened in the past, either because there was something like a civil war, either because there was some guerrilla problems, either because there was some dictatorship that violate human rights. And I don't think that it's possible to have a transition without facing these issues as they were. Everybody has to be responsible. This is a very delicate issue. But I don't think that it's possible to ignore what happened in the past unless that those things will return again and again. 70 years ago, started civil war in Spain. And even in today's Spain, after so many years, after the transition, still emerge the issues of what happened in the past. And this is why, in our case, in addition to the Commission of Truth and Reconciliation of President Elwin, in addition to the Mesa de Diálogo, a dialogue, a working group that was established by President Frey, we established a presidential commission on political prisoners and torture. And I knew that this was an extremely sensitive issue, but I also knew that if our government has some strength, as I thought that we have, it was essential to address this issue. And the Presidential Commission chaired by an important member of the Catholic Church, by a bishop, was able to listen the statements of more than 35,000 Chileans, men and women, that declare and decommission what has happened to them. And of those 35,000, at the end the commission recognized 29,000 Chileans on which has been committed torture and violations of their own rights. Let me tell you that I do not know of any other country that has dared to go in this direction. But at the same time, let me tell you that it's much healthy for a country to face the issue. The number of Chileans that I met along Chile and the number of Chileans that you send a copy of the report with the 29,000, each of them has a number. The number of Chileans that I've met along the country and say to me, I am the 50,532. The number for them represent the recognition that they were being in prison because of political reasons and not for other reasons, that they were not delinquent. This is very impressive. And they feel, most of them, now for the first time, after so many years. And I think that it's essential, as I say in my speech, that every country, that if there is going to be a tomorrow, the tomorrow exists only after you settle the account with the past. It's not possible. It is not possible to think as to believe that I know what happened, but I don't want to return to that. When you do that, those things will return again and again. It requires some courage to do it, but at the same time, it requires to understand how the internal innings of the society work. What are the motto? What are the engines of a society? Until what extent those issues that are extremely painful has to be faced if we want to beat the future. Therefore, I think that in many Latin American countries, still this is a challenge that has to be tackled. And nobody can say, we did this and this and this in my country. Every country is different. But every country has to find a way to be able to face these issues. And it seems to me that moral values, ethical standards are going to be essential. Every country is different. Every country knows that this is very difficult. But nobody is above the law. And if we are going to have a rule of law with regard to our democratic system electing our own authorities, this is also part of the rule of law. It's not a question that because you used to be so important, then I will forget what you did. At the end, things will emerge again and again. The third area, or the third challenge for Latin America, is probably one of the most difficult to tackle. How Latin America is going to be able to stand up and be part of the global debate that exists today. I know that this is difficult. Very close to Berkeley, here in San Francisco, in 1945, the world, right after the Second War, signed the Charter of United Nations. And that means that after 2 world wars, the human beings thought that was possible to build a body, a multilateral institutions, where you can find solution to the question of peace and war, or to the question of economic development, or to the question of the respect for human rights. Now, the big issue is that now, 60-something years, 65 years later, what is the new institution building that we are going to have at the multilateral level? Till what extent United Nations represents what is the political situation of the world in 1945? Till what extent the 5 members of the Permanent Security Council with a right to veto represent what was the power of 1945 and not today's power? Till what extent are we going to be able to have a situation where, at the world level, the world is going to be every day more global? As Mandela used to say, globalization is here to stay. And you have to prepare for that. And to prepare for that means that you have to learn how to compete in that globalized world. In our case, we are in a small country. We decided to open up our frontiers and to open up for trade. I understand. One receipt is not the same for the others. When you are a large country, normally you would like to protect your own frontiers. Your economy tends to be a little bit more closed. Other has economy more open. Nevertheless, what I do think is that if globalization is here to stay, you need some rules. If you have globalization without rules, then you are not recognizing that there is a lot of phenomena that are produced and the solutions are beyond the frontiers of each particular country. If there is something like a social warming, if there is something like the problem with the ozone layer, those problems are going to be solved, if we are able, at the global level and not at the country level. Where are you going to solve the issues about the human rights violations? And every day we know more and more that those are international issues, that the question of human rights is not a question of a particular country, that whenever a human right is violated, some other human being has the right and the duty to denounce that, no matter where they live. That frontiers in connection with human rights violations cannot exist anymore. And this, I think, is part of what a human being has been able to get. So the big issue is, for Latin America, how Latin America is going to be able to speak with one voice if Latin American voice is going to be heard in world affairs. Until what extent it is one thing to integrate in our own space, in our own geography, and it's another thing, how can we speak at the same time with one voice? Europeans have been able to integrate and at the same time to have the mechanism to discuss in world affairs. This is not still the case in Latin America. Nevertheless, let me tell you that my own experience is when in a very crucial moment in United Nations with regard to Iraq, the 2 Latin American members of the Security Council at that time, Chile and Mexico, were able to have a common position. And through that common position, we were able to influence some other members of the Security Council of third world countries from some other continents. And at the end, it was important and it was possible then to have a position that we thought was essential, precisely because when we say everything has to be done within the United Nations, what we are saying is everything has to be done according to the rule of law that mankind has given to the United Nations. Because when you're in a small country, the rule of law in the multilateral world is extremely important. Otherwise, how are you going to compete? And the fact that we have some bilateral trade agreement doesn't mean that it's not necessary still to have a lot of measures to be taken at the multilateral level in the case of trade, in the case of financing, in the case of environment, in many other cases. And therefore, I think that it's essential for us to say we need rules, and otherwise, in this global world, the rules are going to be posted by the most powerful. And I think that mankind has evolved enough to believe that it's possible then to have our own rules in this globalized world that we are going to live and we will be living in this 21st century. And then, let me tell you, to conclude this presentation, that I have came here to Berkeley. Berkeley was in the 60s, with freedom of speech, a university that was able to open to new ideas. At the end, you know, the universities are the only institution, as far as I know, that since the Middle Ages, when the universities emerged, has been the institutions that are supposed to think about the societies where they live. Always human beings, always societies, has an institution to think about society. Now, to think about society, let me tell you, is very dangerous. Because once that you think about society, you think that it's possible to improve society, changing a little bit. And those that are happy with today's status quo doesn't want to have changes even a little bit. And therefore, universities are rather dangerous institutions. But this is the duty of those institutions. This is the reason why they are supposed to have autonomy, to have freedom to think about. And if you have freedom to think about, then creativity is so important. I'm not going to be talking about creativity in this part of this country, where so much creativity has emerged in so many areas like the information technologies. But if that is the case then, what should be then the new ideas that universities can provide in this global world? This is very much like I used to think, like when at the end of the Middle Age, the feudal system was transforming and emerged the national state. It was not the Duke or the Count anymore. When you have the Louises in France, or the national state in the UK. And therefore, the right, quote unquote, to print money went from the feudal laws to the national government. And then the kings put their face in the print money, in the coin. During those days, that was the only way to recognize a king. You know, there was no pictures in the journals. But what I'm trying to say is, when you move from that system to the national state, and the laws now went from the feudal system to the national state, was a tremendous change. And every day more, you will discover that some system from the national state that we have today, in some areas, will be moving to a more global world. And it's here when I think that it's so important the universities to think about, because they had the freedom to do it in such a way that no responsible leader of any country can do it. In short, when I came here to this university to share with you some of my experiences as a president of Chile during 6 years, what I'm trying to say is, we tried to move the frontier of what was possible in Chile. And I think that I have more freedom because of what President Elwin and Frey did before myself. And I say that because I was able to move the frontier of what was possible, then Michelle Bachelet probably had more freedom to do most those things that I couldn't make it. But this is the way that democracy works. This is the way by which, when you say, I wanted to move the frontier of what was possible, in terms of trade, in terms of new products, in terms of human rights, in terms of education, in terms of, and I would like to conclude. I went to see some new huge public work that I was being done in Chile in a highway, and everybody was so proud of what they did, and suddenly emerged a peasant and say, Mr. President, and when the highway is going to be in my field? And I say, where's your field? It was far away. And then I thought that probably we moved the frontier of what was possible in such a way that he also thought that was possible to have a highway crossing in front of his piece of land. In the past, that was really impossible. Now for them, it was quite possible. And he was right. Because if you are going to compete in today's world, better you have pay highways. Otherwise, the fruit that you're going to export are going to arrive in a bad way to the other countries. This is part of the story. And therefore, I think that at the end of this talk, what I would like to share with you, my optimism about what we have been able to do in Chile. If we did that, that was because we have the backing of the majority of the Chilean people. And I felt that majority in different ways. But above all, we have the passion of believing that it was possible to do those things. And therefore, when I came here, what I'd like to do is to share with you what has been part of that experience, to see if it's possible then to keep moving the frontier of what is possible. After that, because you move the frontier of what is possible, then the utopian dreams that all of us have, we think that are closer. But because they are closer, then the frontier keep moving. And in the end, that's progress. And this is what everything is about mankind. Let me say thank you for this opportunity to talk with you, and let me thank the university for this distinction that I received as a recognition to what the Chileans did in this country of the South. Thank you very much. Y concluimos en español, dado que es el 18, con un ¡Viva Chile!
I would like to thank President Lagos, and we have time for several questions. Unfortunately, we had quite a number of people who were not able to make it into the auditorium here tonight. We are also webcasting this to a large overflow room in Evans Hall, so it's only fair that the first question that we'll take comes from the overflow room.
Oh, good.
And the question is on globalization. What dangers does globalization pose to stability in Latin American countries? And is there a trade-off between the social and economic prosperity of Latin American nations?
Well, first of all, I think that globalization is here to stay. And then the big issue is what are going to be the rules of that process? And who are going to participate in that process? When we are talking about trade, well, I think I can say this here. We didn't like anti-dumping legislation of some particular countries. Well, we didn't like agricultural subsidies of some other countries. Well, when we were in Doha at the multilateral discussion, with the Europeans and the Japanese, we were able to have a common front vis-à-vis anti-dumping. And that was the first time that anti-dumping was accepted, that has to be discussed at the trade level. And then when we discuss about agricultural subsidies, then we have some other friends vis-à-vis the Europeans that have some problem with the agricultural subsidies. In other words, I think that, first of all, it's a question that how we're going to have that in our rules. But the other question is how we're going to prepare our own internal societies to compete in that world. And that means how we're going to have on-the-job capacity training, how we're going to have skilled workers, how we're going to be able to have, in addition to skilled worker, entrepreneurs that are able to do that, those things that have to do. Let me tell you this. We are very proud exporting our fruits. But in the near future, you are not going to export peaches or apricots or melons. You will export a fruit that is called like that, but is protected by a patent and has a very specific quality. So the issue is, are we going to buy the patent, or are we going to be able to produce our own? And that is going to be the world of the 21st century. So, if you have copper, because this is to answer the question, are we going to use the money of copper? It's a lot of money, copper prices going up, to pay public servants? Or are we going to use the price of copper in science and technology to do the research that is required for that? Our friends in Argentina, they export in quantity much more wine than we. But we receive in dollars much more dollars than the Argentinians because we export quality. Bottle. So you see, it's the question that you are going to be in the global world. Now, how are you going to discover? How are you going to discover? What are your major areas of competition? And this is essential. And therefore, you have to prepare for that. But that means if you're going to compete, you need an unskilled labor force, 12 years education minimum 12 years education. In the new plants in the southern part of Chile, requirement, high school finish. It's a new labor force. And therefore, you have to prepare for that. So there are two things. The internal responsibility is at the interior of our own societies. How do you prepare for that? But then the second point is that we would like to compete in a stadium that the field is level, not like this. Sometimes I have the sense that we are competing and we are in this part of the field and the other side in this part. It's much more difficult, to have goals in this part than in this part. And this has to do then with the problem of globalization. How are we going to be able to have a level field? And that is the responsibility of all of us. But the question is that we have to have our internal measures and at the same time external measures in the way that we are able to change the rules of the game. But I think that it's nonsense to say, well, this is too neoliberal, the globalization. No, that's not the discussion. The discussion is that we have to be prepared for that, and if we do, then there's no question, there's no reason why we're not going to do. Look what's going on in the rest of the world. Who can say what's going on in China or what's going on in India? And 10 or 15 years ago, the big issue was Korea. What was Korea in the 1950s? A much more backward country than Chile. And what about Chile? Well, Chile and Sweden in the late 19th century were very much the same. So this depends on what we are going to be able to do, and this is why it's so important when you are talking about opportunity for everybody, education for everybody. This is the only way to compete in the future. But that would be my answer, yeah.
We also, for public events at the center, have questions that come to us over the internet. So the next question came to us from New Zealand. So I can't resist asking it. Do you see a conflict between an expanded Mercosur and the development of a free trade agreement of the Americas?
Well, I don't see a conflict. The question is that with regard to a free trade agreement of the America, it's necessary to distinguish that countries are so different and situation is so different. It is not true that one size fits all. I mean, if you are a teeny island in the Caribbean, or if you are a huge country like Brazil or Mexico, I talk on this in several occasions and say, look, a free trade agreement for the Americas means that we are going to compete. Okay, that's fine. But we'll need to have some time in order to have some sort of asymmetry between those that are much more advanced than the others. Therefore, it's not possible to reduce tariff for everybody at the same time. First question. When we were discussing with our friends in Bolivia the questions of trade, the balance of trade for Chile is extremely favorable. So we decided and said to the Bolivians, look, we will reduce tariff of Bolivian products going to Chile to 0 right now for all the products with only 2 exceptions. In agricultural products, there were some problem. And with regard to Bolivia, we say, you take your time to reduce tariff. And that's asymmetry. And I think that it's essential to recognize asymmetry in this kind of agreement. Second point, when Chile signed the agreement with the United States and with Europe, the income, the fiscal income that we receive from our tariff imposed on the American products and the European products meant that we were seeing a reduction of $400 million per year because the tariff didn't come to us anymore. I'm quite sure that the United States still didn't discover how much was the reduction in the fiscal income of the United States government because of the trade agreement with Chile. I say this, compare now with a small country in the Caribbean. In many of those countries, tariffs represent 40% of total fiscal income. And normally, the major provider of goods and services is the United States. You have a free trade agreement of the Americas in that country, and it's not a question to compete, it's a question that the fiscal income is going to be reduced. So unless you take care in consideration this kind of issues, it's going to be extremely difficult to have a free trade agreement of the Americas. And therefore, we have to learn from some other successful experiences like the Europeans, where you have a transfer of money from the most developed to the most developing countries within the European Union in some particular areas as the only way to solve these issues. If it is possible to have a fund in order to help those countries that are going to be reduced the income because of the reduction in tariff. In other words, I think that it has to be possible to have a free trade agreement if we recognize different things. Second, in an agreement of this kind, there are some countries that would like to be extremely open and to put everything there. financial services, government procurement, et cetera, et cetera. Some other countries said, no, I wouldn't like to put government procurement yet. Can you have then some sort of geometric variable? In a country, those countries that would like to have government procurement, well, that's part of the trade agreement of the Americas. You have how many countries? 2, 3, 4, 10, 20 out of the 34? And in some other cases, you can say, no, I'm not going to put the things together. So I think that it's necessary to adjust. Second, I think that it's important, if it's possible, to have, in the case of Mercosur also, to recognize differences. I mean, it's a difficult question in the case of Mercosur, and that difficult question is precisely, among other things, because the different sizes of the country. Yeah.
The next question concerns human rights. What, in your opinion, remains to be done in order for Chile to construct a viable historical memory and advance national reconciliation? What obstacles, if any, might stand in the way of achieving these goals?
Well, I think that something very important is to implement an autonomous institute of human rights in Chile. With two major ideas: to preserve all what already exists in Chile with regard to past human rights violations that are there. Can you imagine how many documents are of those 35,000 Chileans making a statement? And those are still a private statement and are going to be public in many years' time from now. And therefore, this is something that has to be preserved. And second, how that institution may be in a situation to educate, explain what is the role of human rights in today's Chile, in terms of the educational system, in terms of the different institutions that have to be tackled that. In other words, I think that most of the question has to do how to establish an institution that can take care of the issue of human rights, to preserve memory, and at the same time to be able to address the major issues in the near future. Yeah.
The next question concerns the environment. What are your views on the role of business, the community, and the government in terms of protecting the environment?
Well, first of all, I think that the question of environment is going to be a question here to stay for a long time. The way that we handle the issue of environment is a question of the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century, no more than that. When my friends in Europe sometimes lecture me a little bit about the environment and the way to handle those things, I say, well, I think that you are right. After all, you destroyed the forest that we had in the southern part of Chile at the time of Julius Caesar and the Roman Empire, which is true. But let me be serious on this. I think first that mankind is going to be more and more conscious about this issue, and therefore we may have some global trade, but probably some green barriers are going to emerge if countries doesn't fulfill some international regulations, either in terms of mining, of energy production, or any other goods and services that you can require to export. In other words, it is essential to have some kind of rules in this particular area. Number two, I think that mankind and the human being has been able to do two things: to have development that is sustainable in a sense that it's not enough development as such, but sustainable development is going to be every day a more important concept. And therefore, it's going to be essential to find new ways in order to preserve environment. And the issue of climate change, and what are the different discussions on that, if the melting of what's going on in the Antarctic or in the Arctic is becoming a more and more pressing issue, and there is no question on that. And the same with energy, And the same with all the different forms of alternatives in the age of energy. Hydroelectric energy is the more clean energy of all. Nevertheless, when you are talking to discuss a new hydroelectric plant, normally hydroelectric plant means that you have to build the press, and that means then that you're going to, some land is going to be irrigated, and then you have some problems. So I think that this is going to be one of the most pressing international and national issues in this century. And I think that mankind has been able to advance so much in order to be able to take care of this. But sustainable development is going to be the trademark of every society that want to be successful. Otherwise, this is not going to be the case. Now, in Chile, we have been able to have our own system. The last thing that I did as a president was I signed a legislation approved by Congress in order to prohibit the use of some substances with regard to the, how do you say, efecto invernadero? Gas. And then what we did was to forbid the import of those substances to Chile. But what is Chile, you know? The major responsibles are countries that are living in the northern hemisphere. So I sent a letter to the G8 and explained why for me it was extremely important, and this was something that the major responsibility is on the G8. Now I know that a year ago, one of the issues discussed by the G8 under the chairmanship of Prime Minister Blair was the issue of environment and climate change. But I think that those are the ones that has the major responsibility. But at the same time, I say, but we receive the effects from that. In the extreme south of Chile, in Punta Arenas, in one of the most southern cities in the world, when you have a bright sun like the one that we have today here in California, normally kids that go outside use some protection in the head because the ozone layer is so thin that then the rays, ultraviolet rays, produce some damage in those kids. Now, if it is possible to have something like that, myself as the president of Chile, what can I do other than send a letter? I mean, it's a very serious thing, and I can understand that some countries doesn't like the Kyoto Agreement, but then I say, well, if you don't like that, give me what would you like. Where should I go? Where should I complain about these issues? The Kyoto represents some important advance, but it's not enough. And therefore, it's my impression that we are facing here a very difficult problem, but at the same time, the will to overcome these difficulties depends in us. This is something being produced. Last year, we sent a mission to the South Pole, and they were to measure every kilometer, how thick is the ice, just to make sure if the difference in the ice was because of the Industrial Revolution, I mean, during the last 200 to 300 years, that the Industrial Revolution is linked to this question, or this is, as some people used to think, a long-term issue that has to be dealt in some other ways. But up to now, all that we have is that probably everything starts with regard to the Industrial Revolution, and therefore this is something to be done. Now, if you are a small country, today the expedition up to the South Pole was quite an interesting issue, and I think that the result of the research is being underway, and what we are going to demonstrate is that it's because it's human-made. The deterioration in environment is human-made, and it's not represent long-term trends in the evolution of the planet, as some people used to think about. Yeah.
It feels like we're just beginning the discussion, but unfortunately, we are about out of time. I'd like to thank Chancellor Birgeneau for being with us tonight. I would like very much to thank Luisa Duran and President Lagos for being with us today. Thank you.